this fundamental question about the operation that Russia, the special operation, as they
Yeah.
call it. And is that changing? Is what is the latest? What is the mindset right now in Russia? Is that special military operation still, or they're thinking of maybe changing the strategy, changing the way that they're fighting, or with the new escalations, with the use of drones the Ukrainians are using against them? What is going on in Russia, in your opinion?
What I can report, Nima, is contacts with military sources over the weekend when everybody's at their dacha, and you understand it's mid-August, it's midsummer holidays. The joke in Russian is that it's not any longer the Spetsalnaya military operation, special military operation, but rather the Strannaya military operation. Strannaya means strange, and in Russian, this kind of strange carries the same meaning as in English. Strange meaning mad, strange meaning confusing, strange meaning bizarre. Um, what this means is the following. There's no official change. In fact, that's the problem. My sources understand the problem is this. On the one hand, the special military operation continues to move slowly, minimizing as best it can, and the troop commanders can arrange, and the Kremlin orders, minimizing casualties at the front. On the other hand, there's no doubt that casualties are rising. The drone swarms are growing on the Russian hinterland. So the question becomes not what the land operations are doing and not their slow success moving westward, but rather what's the effect, the success, or the failure, or the weaknesses of the so-called special military operation when looking at the amount of damage that the Ukrainian, British, NATO, and American side are inflicting through new kinds of drones, long-range drones, on all sorts of targets, including civilians, in Russia itself. So strange is in a way an ironic reference. It's showing that that there is, while no loss of confidence in President Putin, there's no alternative. There is confusion and lack of confidence in the extent to which the special military operation represents a successful way of first uh, destroying the Ukrainian, US, and NATO capacity to inflict damage on Russia, destroying, and second, the deterring the US, the British, the NATO allies from escalating as they're doing. So Strannaya here means that the special military operation is being understood by my military sources as having confusing impacts. Okay, that's the meaning of it. We've discussed this before, but it's worth repeating again. President Putin continues to say that for every Ukrainian attack, and let's be clear, there were 600 drones over the Moscow region on Monday night. Over Monday night, there were 791 drones counted over Russia, including the Moscow region. Some get through. Okay, so President Putin's line has been tit for tat, mirror. Now, what's the mirror if that's the restriction on drone warfare that now includes cluster munitions? What my sources are pointing out, and you can see it in the military blog reports, is that the Ukrainians are now using cluster munitions, tiny metal balls in the explosive mixture and warhead of these drones, which are intended to kill civilians. And that's what they're doing. What's the tit for tat for that? Asks my Russian sources. Then there were additional attacks on Wildesbury warehouses in the Moscow region on Monday, Tuesday. That's an attack on the middle class internet, Amazon type retail system. What's the tit for tat for that? What then is to stop? And this is what my military sources are saying, not for lack of confidence, I need to emphasize, in the eventual success of the Russian war, but rather, and not for lack of confidence, I repeat again, in the military command or the Kremlin, as we're only 4 weeks away from election now. What's to stop this escalation? Well, my sources over the weekend at the Dacha, while relaxing, say we are destroying their capability to continue fighting. How long will that take before they capitulate? Answer, it doesn't matter. It might take 3 months, it might take 3 years. Remember, we've said it before, the NATO powers and President Trump signed on to a commitment to fund 2 more years of war. So what we have is some dismay, and that's where Strannaya, the special military operation terminology, becomes not only ironic, it becomes a criticism. Are we on the Russian side doing enough? Now, you can put nuclear in the headline of all podcasts and attract an audience, but the nuclear option is not one Russian side thinks seriously. That's not what's involved. Take another example, and do interrupt me if I'm going beyond your question. Take the example over the weekend, so it's breaking news now, of the UK, the British drones that were celebrated over the weekend in the Sunday Times, in the Murdoch press on Sunday. That newspaper announced with some triumphalism that British drones, two in particular, were used for the first time in the past days by the Ukrainian side, and that the British are looking forward to increasing escalation of British drones, drone deliveries to the Ukraine, and drone firings on Russia, both within the short range and within the long range. What then happened? Well, here's where we get into strannaya, strange behavior. On the one hand, you have the British military sources in the London Times saying that we understand the Russians threaten. They now understand we're not nervous any longer. Okay? They are saying critically, the Russians threaten, but we're not nervous. I'm flipping papers because I want to read exactly what the British are saying. One of them, a former general, said Russia will saber rattle. They might even say factories themselves are now legitimate targets, but no credibility is attached to President Putin's tit-for-tat. Okay, that's the way the British appear to have described what has happened over the last few days. They're celebrating. On the other hand, the Russian embassy announced on Monday it rejected the terrorism of British involvement with Ukrainian terrorism in these new drone attacks, and said there will be consequences to pay. That then became a headline Tuesday, Wednesday. Are we in Wednesday yet? Not quite. In Tuesday's headline in the London papers, that the Russian side is threatening consequences to pay if the British drone campaign escalates. What have we got here? We've got strannaya, strange behavior on the Russian side, which is appreciated as empty saber rattling on the other side. And that's a problem the Russian sources I have, the military sources, admit to privately. What then are we saying here? We've got, on the one hand, the total failure of one line in the Kremlin, which has said if Prime Minister Starmer were overthrown and replaced, then the British policy towards Russia would change. Well, now that was the line Kirill Dmitriev, the president's special representative for talking to business in the United States, that was the line he ran every hour on his tweet. It's a total failure, and it's understood as that in Moscow. Instead, we have Prime Minister Andrew Burnham, who's escalating, and they're celebrating that in London on Sunday. And the Russian response through the embassy is there'll be serious consequences to pay with this British collaboration in Ukrainian terrorism, when everybody understands it's not terrorism. Yes, cluster munitions aimed at civilian deaths, which is what's happening, is an attack on civilians. But the Russian side will not do that. On the other hand, the notion of mirror, of tit-for-tat, of mirror and symmetrical response is failing to deter, failing to defend.
John, there was an important interview of Lavrov. He mentioned multiple points in that interview. One of them, which is
Yes.
important right now, is the case of Japan, and Japan designating Russia as its main threat. And well, what is the perception of Russia when it comes to Japan? Is it all about the United States and leverage of the United States, and or is it coming from the NATO headquarters? It means that the United States together with Europeans, or is it something from within Japan? Because there is no way for Japan to be afraid of Russia. Why is that, in your opinion?
Well, there is a long history, a very long history. First of all, Japan attacked the Soviet Union in the 1930s, and one of the first victories of later Marshal Georgy Zhukov was the defeat of a Japanese expeditionary force in Mongolia, in the Russian-Mongolian border areas. That was the beginning. The defeat of the Japanese was the beginning of Zhukov's rise to become a Soviet marshal. The history of Japanese enmity goes back much longer than that. The Japanese fought and destroyed the Russian Imperial Navy in a series of battles in 1904, 1905. I have those particular illustrations of that battle, the Japanese cartoons that were produced to show Japanese people who had won the naval battles, showing the Russian cruisers sinking, and the Russian cartoons put up on placards around St. Petersburg, 1904, 1905, showing Russians who couldn't read that the Russians had won the battles. Well, these make a highly interesting contrast on my office walls. The fact of the matter is that there are 2 centuries of war preparations by the Japanese against Russia. And Russia defeated the Japanese finally, was one of the winning victors of the war against Japan in 1945. Okay, now, since then, Japan does not have, and with Russia, an end of war set of treaties. Japan continues to make territorial claims, especially on the Kuril Island chain. There remain both territorial and traditional Japanese-Russian let's say, hostilities that haven't been solved. From a Russian point of view, and Minister Lavrov has explained this, so has President Putin, the Russian side felt that there was greater flexibility and the possibility in the long term of reaching real end of war and real redevelopment of relations with Shinzo Abe, the then prime minister. The current prime minister, however, is viewed in Moscow as supportive of remilitarization of Japan. So I come now directly to your question. With all of that unsettled history, both territorial and military, all of that suspicion and historical doubt about each other's peaceful intentions towards one another, the problem remains now, is the United States intentionally encouraging Japan to remilitarize against China and Russia at the same time? In other words, a rerun of World War II and adversaries and antagonism. Is that US policy for Japan? And is Japan, under the current government, remilitarizing in much the same way, in parallel with US policy to encourage Germany, the UK, and France to remilitarize? In fact, each of the NATO allies to remilitarize. What's the basis of remilitarization ideologically? The enemy is Russia in Europe. The enemy is China and Russia in Asia. So that's the, let's put it, the strategic and the ideological problem. And to the extent that the current Japanese administration is doing everything possible to remilitarize, the constitutional limitation on self-defense forces is no longer practical or applicable. You'll find the Japanese foreign ministry regularly and explicitly attacks the Japanese loss of memory of the pogroms they inflicted on the Chinese people during the initial stages of World War II. The Chinese are much more explicit in opposing Japanese remilitarization than the Russians, but both sides are equally concerned that the US policy is to get Japan to finance remilitarization, to buy from the United States and build up a new warfare fighting platform against both powers. That's the background, and that's where we are today.
Yeah. The point that you mentioned about what's going on between Europe and Russia, one of the other important points that was mentioned during the interview, Lavrov was talking about the so-called EU's shadow fleet inspections. It
Yes.
basically mentions how Europe is trying to confiscate cargo to fund Ukraine. And where does that go, John? And how do you see the situation? Maybe some sort of escalation going to come out of, between the two sides, Russia and Europe, and how far that would go, in your opinion? Because in the eyes of Russian, this is piracy. This is nothing more than, it's not about inspection or anything of that sort. This is piracy, and they're going to respond to that. It means that they're going to hit back those countries who are participating in this. What is your understanding of that?
Well, here's again where we are, Nima, with the word strannaya. This is what's strange. I'm looking down because I'd like to exactly quote the way Lavrov expressed this so that we can go back to Putin's briefing on board the Varyag heavy cruiser last week in a naval review of Vladivostok. Here's what Lavrov said August 14 in his interview. He said, President Putin was very clear, I'm reading, when he tactfully said that Russia will respond in kind to this robbery. We will choose the targets as we deem fit by focusing on the ships serving countries which have made pillaging and piracy their official policy. First, the word President Putin was clear when he tactfully said, is in a way an irony directed at President Putin. It's a way of saying, when you're at war, why are you being tactful when they are doing this violence, force against our cargoes, our ships, our mariners, and so forth? Tactfully was carefully used by Lavrov, and the audience for that's in the Kremlin. Then the last point, ships serving countries which have made pillaging and piracy their official policy. You too used the word piracy, and the reason you used it is that the Russian official line is these attacks on shipping are piracy. However, from a naval point of view, it's not piracy, it's war. It's war. Piracy is different. Privateering is a form of war between states when the command of the states, the monarchs, the British Queen Elizabeth I, engaged or privatized attacks on enemy vessels, Spanish gold carriers coming from the Caribbean, engaged private operators to do the attacks. So, and then share the proceeds with the monarch, with the state, with the crown. This is not piracy, it's war. However, Russia is not at war with the United States, even when US Marines land on Russian flagged vessels and seize Russian cargoes. It's called piracy. Piracy at sea, terrorism on land. This is a way of minimizing the nature of our current conflict. This is what makes it a special military operation in the Ukraine and piracy abroad. This combination of terms and terminology and ideas and official language is what's Strannaya. It's strange. How then is the Russian side proposing to respond? Let's go back to Lavrov. We will not, and I'm quoting again, we will not sink to their level. Instead, we will adopt much harsher methods to destroy everything that enables the West to fuel Kiev's war machine. We are already doing this, and they are already moaning. Now, what we have here is the notion of mirror imaging. What we had last week was the commander of the Russian Pacific Fleet responding to President Putin in a briefing on board the flagship of the fleet. Admiral Leonard said that the monitoring unfriendly vessels moving cargoes through Russian territorial waters or off Russian shores in the Pacific. And then he quoted a number of hundreds of these vessels, of approximately, I haven't got the numbers in front of me, approximately 1,000 vessels monitored over the last 3 or 4 month period. At least 300 to 400 were of enemy states, call them unfriendly. They represent a target of opportunity. That's a threat of tit-for-tat response. Then the question becomes, will Russia respond to these naval attacks by the other side, including US forces? US forces have attacked and boarded Russian cargo vessels, Russian, not necessarily Russian flagged vessels, the so-called shadow fleet in the Indian Ocean, in the Mediterranean, in the Atlantic, French in the South Atlantic, French in the Mediterranean, British and Americans in the North Atlantic off Scotland. We can go on and on. What in fact, what in practice, what at war will the Russian side do? There are a number of critics on the Russian side in print saying it's not enough. We're acting too little, too late. So what we have then is uncertainty, uncertainty, and that means also criticism. That also means debate behind closed doors. Let's look exactly at what happened at the Black Sea over the last few hours. On the one hand, it's been trumpeted that Vice President Vance asked Zelensky, the Zelensky regime, and Vladimir Zelensky in person, not to attack the CPC, the Caspian Pipeline Consortium terminal at Russian Black Sea port Novorossiysk. Vance understood and Zelensky understood the request was to stop attacking the Kazakh oil, which is piped all the way from the Caspian shore of Kazakhstan to this outlet for the export shipment of Kazakh oil out the Black Sea. In fact, that's what the sides agreed, and there has been a suspension of Ukrainian attacks on the CPC terminal. What the Ukrainians are now saying is the agreement with Vance was to suspend attacks on non-Russian vessels carrying non-Russian, meaning Kazakh oil, moving in and out of that terminal. What then has happened is that a Greek tanker called the Skiros was hit by Ukrainian drones. No individuals were hurt. Insignificant damage was inflicted, while the Skiros had just loaded and was proceeding out of Russian territorial waters into the Black Sea, carrying Russian oil. That's why the Ukrainians said they attacked it. Now, first of all, there is in place an American-Ukrainian agreement. Don't hit the Kazakh terminal, not only because it's got Kazakh oil in it, but because the terminal is partly owned by Chevron.